This is, I think, what I remember best about it, or I felt like this kind of opened up an avenue of talking about work with Frank, that she was in the arts, and looking at this work and just thinking about how Frank operated and sort of his legacy. I think he was one of the first architects of his generation, and Gary had a very different, specific relationship with fine art, with the Ferris Group, was literally sort of the artists in LA, but in Frank's generation, in the Santa Monica or the LA school, those guys were more kind of hermetically architects, and I think Frank really liked working with people outside his discipline, but who were really serious about theirs. And all the discussion of color, every time he talked about color, it was always an attribution to an artist or design. You know, I think it was coded almost more by association than certainly by kind of. I don't think there was a geographical angle to it.
So this almost like signature yellow that started with Michel Lemy's house was supposed to be suggested by Michel Lemy, from what I heard.
Yes.
And it's supposed to be the color of retail. And that's how it came to be.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that.
No, I hadn't.
Yeah.
That was,
I like it.
Makes sense.
we have tidbits
The
of
color of
stories.
retail. It doesn't scare you off. It sort of allures you.
Multiple times that if he had built this house, his career would have been very different. It was part of a group of people in Southern California, I think, who are working very hard to kind of find a way out of that moment in architecture. And I think what we see on the table in various ways are you know, a really consistent body of work that is succeeding at working away from that point. I think along with all that, and Joe, I think you touched on this earlier, and I think the Walker exhibition was a kind of interesting moment where Frank actually had some time to sit down and assess where he was at that moment in his development. And I think that we can't discount, you know, the importance of what it means to come to Southern California and be committed to building, and realizing, accepted with very, very few exceptions, that you're going to build stick buildings with cementitious skins over paper, because the seismic environment that we work in necessitates us to do that to meet the economic criteria that buildings get built in out here. So I think Frank gradually, over the years, I think that might be one consistent thing that would go through all the different kind of strands that made up the production in the office. But that Frank, and I think it's really clear in Divine Design, that the idea of kind of pulling those apart, pulling that stick skeleton either away or letting it be exposed, or skinning it with other materials so that it could have a presence rather than a visual presence rather than just a structural one. And as I said earlier, we all kind of felt like we were burdened with one way to build here in Southern California in those days. And I think Frank gradually took that and made it a real virtue, and I think worked with all of us in some ways to come to new understandings about how that construction system, which really is marvelous, could become more than, you know, what it is in the average dingbat in West Hollywood.
I think the question of folding, or this whole question of kind of developing an architecture of envelopment, I think it became really important in the last couple of years, and I feel like I knew Frank. You know, I have the least history here, but I have to say I got to know Frank, frankly, just as his illness was becoming public. It certainly had been a factor in his life for a while, and I feel like a number of my later conversations with him about what he was interested in architecture had to do with the kind of with a kind of psychological predicament he found himself in, and developing his work as a designer. Against the grain of that, or to come to terms with it in certain respects. I do feel like, certainly, I taught with Frank, I think his last semester he was teaching at UCLA, and it was inspiring. He was unbelievably passionate about teaching. I took the job thinking I'm just going to teach for Frank, and he was there all the time. He loved it. He absolutely adored it. But it was also, just as he was going to, and I'm going to come back to this question, because Mitchell, I've come away from The installation at MoCA that was really, I think, sort of the retrospective
The
closest
Walker
to
or the Mocha?
at MoCA. This was the one at the temporary
This is the one with all the
contemporary.
folded
Lots of
situation.
folded surfaces.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really, I think, the most extreme expression of some of the questions Stephen's asking about. And walking with him through that, I mean, it really seemed on some levels to be a kind of conciliatory space for him. He simply liked being there. He felt, you know, and I think in the last year or two of his practice, a lot of the work had to do with making sense of a very particular predicament he found himself in.
I think one thing that should be said is I had a conversation with Frank during the time that he was sick. I knew him before he was diagnosed with AIDS. I knew him when he was diagnosed. I knew him when he, not with AIDS, but HIV. I know when it transitioned. I knew when he couldn't take the medicine. I, transported him to hospitals. I knew a lot about Frank and was privileged to spend a lot of wonderful time. But I asked him, because we had that relationship, and I said, are you angry? Are you frightened? How do you deal with it? He said, no, I'm actually happy that I have what I have because it has made me push all that much quickly. I would never have gotten to where I've gotten. Maybe ever. Because if I didn't have to push so hard to do so much, because he didn't know, he kept on thinking somebody else would fall under. I mean, he had two people that are still going strong that he thought for sure would collapse before he, and thankfully they haven't. But he embraced it, and he said, well, this is what I have, and now I'm going to use it, and it was a force.
But I do think there is one thing that distinguishes his work, in my mind, always distinguished him as a person. I always see it in his work. And, he was for all of his, he was sometimes over-dramatic, melodramatic, bigger than life, mannered, sometimes stereotypical in his behavior, usually just to see if he could provoke you. But there was also a vulnerability to him as a person, a genuine vulnerability. Like, even when he was acting out in some of the most difficult ways in the office, it was very rare that any of us, I think, would really bite back with him, because you could really hurt him, and you knew you could. And I think some of that same kind of, his heart really was on his sleeve as a person underneath all that other stuff, underneath the kind of society architect. And I think that same kind of genuineness and heart on your sleeve is in much of the work, and allows us both into it in terms of content, the content that he brought to it as a designer, and just a sensibility. I remember one time an old 80s piece of writing that Charles Moore did on Rudolf Schindler, and he characterized Schindler's work that way. There's a vulnerability to Schindler's work that he found very valuable because it was a way into the work. And I think Frank, maybe going back to the old garage days, I think that was a quality that he brought both to his relationships and to his